So hello, everybody, and welcome to part 4 of this UiPath Apps Developer Series. And this part of the series is going to focus exclusively on data service, but we'll also be covering and correlating some of the topics that we spoke in the previous parts of this series. For those who haven't met us, my name is Andy Menon. I am the founder of RPA Vanguard, and also the host of the RPA Vanguard YouTube channel. My co-host Pradeep Shukla is a fellow MVP and is also the co-host of our other channel, the Automation Rocket Ship. And along with Priya, who is our third partner in crime, we host a lot of topics on RPA on the Automation Rocket Ship channel. So I would request you to check these two channels out. So in today's session, what we'll be doing is we'll kick off with a demo of a UiPath app. And that app tries to correlate everything that we have discussed before, along with today's topic, which is data service. And then we'll go through a quick tour of the data service entity that is being part of today's demo. And once we have done that and we have the basic understanding of the use case that that I'm going to demonstrate, we go into the details of how to integrate data service entities with apps. And as I said in session 2, we will be looking at some of the functions that are specifically tailored to work with the data service. And here we are looking at the filter function of UiPath apps. And then the next part that we are going to look at is a very powerful feature, a very convenient feature, and that is the data context feature of data apps. And with that, what we'll be looking at is how to assign data awareness to not just one control on your app, but to a group of controls on your app. And in that process, also look at the lookup function, which is another function that is tailor-made to work with data service. And then we learn how to update or delete data service records from the app using the data context feature. Now, time permitting, there is one more function called the named GUID. And in the context of data service, if we have time, I will try to cover that as well, because there are a few subtleties involved when using data service and GUID functions. So this is a summary of what we have spoken about in session 2 about apps, functions, and expressions. In that session, we had covered most of the functions with exception to the ones highlighted. In this session, we will try to cover filter, lookup, and GUID. So with that, I'm going to switch over to the demo app. I hope you're able to see the app on my browser. Yes?
Yes, I can see.
Okay, great. Thank you. So what you're seeing on the screen is a near real world use case. And this is a vehicle registration renewal system. Basically, what it does is it allows customers to, or vehicle owners to submit for their application for renewing their vehicle registrations. And a new registration will be automatically generated by the system, and it will be assigned an expiration date. For example, if today is October 2022, then the expiration date in my state at least is October 2024, 2 years from now. So the owner comes in, the owner submits the information about their automobile, and then when the owner submits the application, a few things will happen. The first, this record is going to be added to a queue, right? Pradeep spoke about how we add information from an app to a queue, and that is a JSON enabled queue. And then once the app hears back from the queue confirming that the item has been added, it takes all the information of this form and then adds it to a backend data service, right? So this is one side of it. On the other side, when the item hits the queue, it triggers an automation. And here is that automation as visible in the assistant. It is called a vehicle registration renewal automation. What that automation does is it reads the item from the queue. It generates a physical text file that mimics a registration certificate and assigns an expiration date, and then takes that file and uploads it to the storage bucket. Right now, how are these tied together? When the vehicle owner submits the application, the app generates a submission ID, basically a unique ID. And the registration file that is generated will also have the same submission ID. And that way, the app can identify the results of what happened after the items hit that queue, right? So again, in the last session, we spoke about the fact that we can submit items to queue, but we really can't read what goes on in a queue. And the better part of this session will focus on how we can have one mechanism by means of which we can relate what happens to the queues to how the app can get that information via data service, right? So with that, I'm going to start my demo. I'm going to take a specific use case because it is a very funny use case. I'll explain later, but assume that this is the car I'm registering. It is it's a Dodge. The model is Hellcat and the year is 2015. It is not a new vehicle. So I've got to put in my registration number. I'm going to give it some registration number. And then I'm going to select the state, let's say Massachusetts. And when I hit add reference, you will see a bunch of updates at the bottom that will indicate that the item has been submitted to the queue and also added to data service. There it is. The app has generated a submission ID, and it has also generated a queue reference ID, and it also says that the item has been added to data service. Now, here you will see the app being mobilized, and the app will now generate a file and upload it to the storage bucket. And here is the submission ID. It begins with E5114. And we'll go to the storage bucket to make sure that the registration certificate has been generated. Now here is the vehicle JSON, vehicle registry JSON queue, and the app has been the automation has been triggered by the queue trigger. If I go into storage buckets, here is the vehicle registration renewals. When I click on it, here is a file that begins with E5114, right? That means this submission ID to queues, to automations, to storage buckets, right? Now is the time for us to work our way back. How does the app reconcile with the fact that the queue items have been processed? And for that, we bring in data service, right? And if I go into the data service part of this application, of this automation cloud, I'm going to click on data service. Of course. Here is an entity called vehicle registration. If I click on it, most of the columns are self-explanatory. The vehicle make, the model, the year, the submission ID, as I said, is generated by the app, which is unique. Then obviously you have the registration number. Now, here is where we will be talking about the majority of the functionality with data service, right? Just because an extension has been, a registration certificate has been generated does not mean that it is granted, right, by fiat. It's not. Someone human has to go in, look at the registration, and then approve it, right? And that is where the app comes in and connects to this data service and helps the human administrator or the registrar of vehicles to approve your registration, right? So there are several columns here that you can go through, and it is all documented very well. And there is a video on the RPA Vanguard channel that shows you how to build this application, um, you know, based on the demonstration that I showed you, right? So with that, now let's jump back to the topic at hand, and that is how to integrate this data service entity with our apps. So I am back in the App Studio, and the first thing that you want to do when you want to work with data service entities is basically you open up your app and then you add an entity. And then the dialog box will allow you to connect to either the same the same instance of Automation Cloud or a different instance of Automation Cloud based on your access. And then you click on the entity that you need to draw into your app, right? To consume in your app. So obviously here I have pulled it in, but if you haven't, then you need to go in and select this box. And along with the vehicle registration or whatever entity that you choose, the system users will also get pulled in. This is the built-in behavior. And that is because you might want to regulate the behavior of your app based on the current user who is manipulating the app, right? So once you're done, you click add. And once you add your entity, you can view that entity here under your entities node. So that's the first step in actually integrating your data service with your app. And clicking on the entity obviously will give you all its metadata, including the descriptions that I just showcased in the data service of the Automation Cloud. So which is pretty convenient. Now, the first step for us after we integrate the data service with our app is how did we create the first entity record in the data service, right? So for that, I'm going to go into my main page, and I'm going to click on the button called Add with Reference. I've named it specifically to remind myself that it does something, but it's actually just a submit button. So if I click Add and then go into the rules, you will see a couple of things happening, which is the first part that I explained. As soon as the user submits the form, it gets added to that JSON queue. And once the item has been successfully added, in return, the app will get back a reference from that queue. And what the app does is it takes that reference queue, and it also takes a uniquely generated submission ID, which is a GUID basically that is generated using a GUID function. And it gathers all the other information that is available in the form, and then it invokes a step called create or update entity record, right? And the step is pretty easy to work with. So if I add a step called create entity, I go in, hit equal to, and then from my entities node, I pull in the entity I'm interested in populating. And immediately you will see all the fields that are available to this app to be, to perform an insert operation. One of the things that you have to note is that anything with an asterisk is a mandatory field. If you do not populate it, your submission will be rejected. That is because these fields have been set as required in the backend data service, right? Barring that, any other column that you see without an asterisk can be left empty, right? So once you have your fields aligned, the next step for you is to actually map the fields that you want to update. So basically, as I said in my series 2 of this part 2 of this series, we assign all our UI controls to app variables, and I have pulled in those app variables to map to this data service entity record. And once I do that, then the next step is to trap the created or updated event. And obviously, once it is created, we can see that the status message is updated, and the which confirms that this record has been added to the data service entity. And we saw how that worked during our demo. The other thing that you might want to consider is the error. Obviously, the error will be trapped in this system variable called error message, and you can always have the app present the error stating that the submission has failed, right? So this is how you create a brand new entity record in your data service. You pull in a create update entity record, map in your mandatory fields and any other field that is required for you to insert as part of the creation operation. And then you specify what happens once you have created and updated a record, whether successfully or if your app in case runs into some kind of failure. So this part is pretty easy, and the next step for us is to work with data service in order to manage the data service entity. Creating records is of course easy. So how do we do that? To view your data service records in your app, the step is pretty basic. I'm going to show you the basic step, and then I'm going to talk about a few efficiency concerns and some of the best practices that you might want to use. So here is a page called data table, but first let me show you how it appears in the app. Now imagine you are the customer. You have already submitted this application for extending your registration. The administrator comes in. Now the administrator is basically from your registrar's office, and he clicks on the administrator link, and it brings the administrator to a data grid, right? And here you can see that there is a table control, and the records have been actually associated with this table control. And there is also a filter here. What that filter does is, by default, it displays records that are pending approvals, meaning any record in the data service that has got extension granted set to false. Now the opposite also is possible. If I slide this off, it will show me records that have already been processed and extensions have been granted, right? But the priority here is to look at the records that are yet to be granted an extension, right? So how did we do this? And what is the role of this slider here? So coming back to the app, there is a page called the data table page. And if I click on this page, there is a table control that I have actually added here. So this is a table control. It's a display control. And the easiest way to associate your data service entity to a table control is to add this control and drag your entity in. So let me do that and show you how to do it in the most normal of circumstances. And then let's go into some efficiency considerations. So I click on add control, and I get go into display. And then here is the table. So popularly we call it a table control. And if I add that in here, so there is nothing populated yet. To do that, you got to set the data source, and the data source is the entity. Again, as usual, I go down to the entity node and pull the vehicle registration entity here. Now, a number of things happen when you do that. First, all the columns of the entity that are visible to you in this app get populated in this table control. Now, some of the things that you can do under normal circumstance is, if you observe the columns, these columns are ordered in the alphabetical order of sort order of their names, right? That is less than desirable, because if you look at the grid above, that grid has got a different sort order, and you can see that it is different here. You see it is laid out in a different order, because this is the order in which I think is most intuitive for an application like this. But that's not the case here. So what you can do is a few things. You can actually move some of these controls to the place you want them. So I can move the column up here, and it will automatically reconfigure itself. You can expand this arrow and change the name of this column if you want to. If you think that it is too large, you can just go back and just say model. Or if you don't need any of the other pieces of information that you think must not be exposed to the current worker who's managing this interface, you can simply delete that field. For example, I may not require queue reference ID, so I can delete that column. So based on what you need to be exposed in this UI, you can configure your table control to view your records the way you want them. Now, this is normally how you would do it if you're starting out for the first time. But there is a basic problem with this approach. The most important being, this kind of approach will load all the records that are in your data service and try to assign them to this control, which is not very good if you're going to have large number of records. Plus, that might not be something that you might want to see, right? You might want to see only the records that you're focusing your attention on. And in this case, I'm going to be focusing my attention on only those records where the extension granted is false, right? So how do we make that happen? Now, if I click on the grid above this, the one that you saw in action, you can see that the data source is not a vehicle registration entity by itself, but it is a filtered version of the entity. So what this data source expression that uses the filter function is telling this data sources, filter the vehicle registration where the vehicle registration extension granted is not true, meaning false, right? And this var pending approvals variable that you see here is actually the one that is tied to this control here. So when I slide the control to the right, the show pending approvals becomes true, right? But I need records where the extension granted is false. So I need something that is not true. And therefore, this expression becomes, give me all vehicle registration records where the extension granted attribute is not the value of the slider, which is not true, which is false. So as a result, in this data grid, you are seeing only those records where the extension granted is false, right? So what you've done here is, by design, you're built some kind of an efficiency into your app so that when this app is being used for the purpose it is designed to be used, there is maximum focus on the records that you plan to process, right? So in this case, I want to process all the registrations as soon as possible and get them out the door, right? So this is this interface demonstrates to you how you can associate uh, a data service entity to a visual control in your app, and also use the filter function to build an efficiency on top of it, so that you have got a leaner app that is more focused on the function that it is intended to perform.
That's very interesting information, Andy.
Yep.
One of the things you touched upon, that how you can add or remove columns in this table.
Yep.
Can you quickly show that you can rename the columns from the
Yep.
data entities that we have?
You mean
Because sometimes the data service entity name is not the exactly the name that you want on your table
correct?
view, right?
Correct. Yeah,
When
we
you're
can do
sharing
that.
with your
Yep.
customer. Yeah.
So we can do that. For example, if I go to model year, I may not want model year. I may just want the year.
Right.
So let's try and do that.
Yeah. So the title of the column can be changed.
Correct.
All right.
And it has already been done here. If you look at some
Very
of
well.
these, they are much longer than they are, they're deemed to be. And so I have actually changed them. You say
Right.
extension granted,
Yeah.
registration number, Q, ref ID, etc. Right?
Yeah. That's what I
Um,
saw. I just wanted to highlight that
yeah,
it's
yeah.
pretty
So
easy.
it's
You can
actually
change
a
the
very
labels for
flexible
that.
and very quick way of doing it, actually. I mean, within a few minutes, you can simply construct a functional app, which is phenomenal, right? Um, so the next on the agenda is a very powerful feature of apps, uh, which is called data context. And I'm going to first demonstrate the interface, and I'm going to talk through that feature, and then we can come back and look at the design details. So that now that I have made a change here, I want to bring the latest app in front of me. So the best practice is to actually close your app, not refresh the app, because I have now changed this to the column has been changed to year. So I want to make sure there are no errors. And I hit preview. And I go to administrator. Sure enough, nothing's broken, and my column is shorter here. It is named year instead of the model year. Now, this functionality talks about how we can actually approve this registration, and in that process, we'll demonstrate how data context works. Now, here is the registration that I want to approve. So I'm the registrar. What the approval system does is the registrar will inspect the automatically generated registration document. And after inspecting it, the registrar will update the valid until date in the month/year configuration, and will also update the extension granted to true, right? Please note that I am on a screen that filters on extension granted is false. It would be very interesting to see what happens once the extension has been granted to this record and the extension granted becomes true. So keep an eye out for that part of the functionality. So I'm going to click on this record. Immediately, the check renewal status button gets activated. Again, please go back to the apps, functions, and expressions under these buttons to see how all these rules have been written. They have been written with simple functions and expressions, not much of rules. So please make a note of of that fact. And when I click on this button checks for a file that has the same name as the submission ID, right? And if that file exists, you are allowed to approve the registration, right? So I check renewal status. Now it says registration is ready for approval. Now I can view that registration. the registration is downloaded. So the registrar will open it and look at it. So the registrar looks at the certificate and says, okay, everything looks good. 10 to 10 2024 is okay. I'm going to approve this registration, right? And this is where data context comes into picture. Excuse me. Earlier, you saw that the entire data service entity was assigned to the stable control, right? But a data context is different. A data context is a reference to a single data service entity record, right? And therefore, the data context at any time can manage only one data service entity record, right? So we call that reference the data context. And you take that data context and you assign it not just to one control, but an entirely uh, an entire group of controls that you have logically organized in your application, right? So now that I have selected this record in the background, this entire record has been put into a data context. And when I click on approve registration, a new form opens up and you can see what has happened. The data that you see here in the background has been transferred into an entirely new form that is floating above the form underneath. Now, this is an example of a data context. What we have done is we have taken the context and assigned it to this entire form. And therefore, any controls in that form, right, that are contained in that form have first-hand knowledge of that record. And based on the nature of the controls of that form, you can either read the records or you can update or manipulate those records, right? Here you can see what we have done is these three pieces of information, the vehicle, year, make, and model are distinctly different, but here we have integrated them together to make a single expression. So what happens is this form is free to work with that one single record. And the beauty of it is any update or any delete operation that you perform on the data context is immediately reflected in the data service. That is the beauty of it. It is a live connection back to data service. Now, here's what I'm going to do. As a registrar, I'm going to look at this and I'm going to approve this registration. One of the interesting things that I'd like to point out is if you try to put in 8/2024, it's going to fail. The expressions behind these text boxes are very interesting. So please go have a look at them. It automatically changes with the current month and the year also functions the same way. So if I put back 10, it works. Now I approve the registration and I say grant approval. Please keep track of what happens to the highlighted record in the backend. There's a gray record here, 1962 MG midget, and I am going to grant approval. You see the record disappeared, right? The record disappeared from this view, which is correct because now that the extension has been granted, the extension granted has turned to true, which means it does not belong to this filter. So where do you go if you want to see this record? You slide the slider control back and you have the record here. And as you can see, the extension has been granted to true and it's valid until 10/2024, right? So let's look at how the data context feature works by going back to the app design.
And you don't have to build anything specific like the behavior that we saw on the front end. If you have to
Yep,
build in a traditional web page, right, you have to use React JS or some other front end
right,
technology to get that
right,
effect, right? You're bringing the data and back and forth. But with apps, you just using a slider control and filter that we looked at, the grid itself can take care of that.
right. So the journey into data context begins with the user selecting a record on this grid, right? So how do you identify which record has been selected? If you look at the events of the grid, there is a value changed rule. And if you implement that rule, you trap the selected record into a variable, which is an app variable, right? So you say the selected record ID equals the data service entity dot ID. So how do I get that? Now apps makes it very, very convenient. If I click on this, and if I go to the table control, remember we are going into the table control of the data table page, and the selected record is already there for you to use, right? You see it's called DT submissions dot selected value. That means it has already identified the selected record for you. All you need to do is get the ID of the record you want to work with. And what you do is you simply drag this ID in here, and now you have the selected record ID, and you can use this to transfer data awareness to any other form in this application via the data context feature, right? So that is the first step. So now that you know what the selected record ID is, I switch to the approve registration form. And if I click anywhere on the approve registration form, most likely the blank white area here, and go to data context, there is a lookup function assigned. So a data context is a recent feature of apps. And here I have assigned the data awareness of that one single record to the entire form. That means anything that is under this container or inside this container has first-hand knowledge of that record. So here, that brings us to the lookup function. Unlike a filter function, a lookup function returns a single record. Please be very, very careful about which function to use. You can use the filter function if you positively know that your search is going to bring up one record. But a lookup function is specifically tailored to return just one record, right? So what I've told the data context is, give me a record from the vehicle registration entity where the ID of that entity record equals the selected record ID, which we just saw how we captured after the user selects a record on that grid. So a single record is returned, and then every control in this form has access to it. So how do I pull the data context into the picture? If I click on any one of these controls here, and if I go to extended until, let's say, if I go to extended month, extended year, and if let us say I remove this here, how do I bind it to the data context? If I go on the left here, do not go into the data table, do not go into the entity. This time you have to go into the data context. Please do remember that. So here the entire selected record is there for me to access, right? And sure enough, the valid extension month is the I think I have to do year of valid until date. Let me check. For example, if I go in here, yeah, var extended month, var extended year. Yeah, I have to do that. Is equal to var extended year. Yeah, I have to bind that here this time. Correct. Okay. So I stand corrected. What I have done here is I brought the binding to the app variable that was generated in the previous step. But how do I now update this record, right? If I have to update this record, I hit on grant approval. Now, when I grant approval, several things are going to happen. the extended date is going to be updated, and that has been generated by those two app variables. The approved flag is going to be set to yes, right? And how does the app know which record it has to update? That's pretty simple. If I go to grant approval, go into events, and if I go to edit rule, here the concept of updating a record is using data context. So how do I do that? I go in and bring that same step here called create or update entity record. But this time, I am not going to select the entity. I'm going to select the data context entity. So entity record. So here is the data context. This is that one single record that you want to update. You pull that in, right? So if I pull that in here or double click, here again, you can see how convenient it is. All the records are automatically mapped for you where you're not updating the original columns. Obviously, you're not updating the extension, the model year. You're not updating the reference ID. You're not updating the registration number. Everything stays the same, but you are going to update only those columns that will require you to approve this registration. So if I go down to the actual step, here you can see that the extension granted has been set to an app variable of that checkbox where you say, yes, approve this registration. And you also update the valid until date with an expression with the month concatenated with the year with a backslash separator, right? And all other steps are the same as creating a record, except that you're updating a record here. Now, please note again, the same rules apply on updating the records to the data service. You have to update everything that is marked with an asterisk, right? So here again, I'm going to correct this and I'm going to say data context dot state. Remember, I am not updating my state, so therefore I'm going to send it back the same way as it is. And once it is updated, you capture your notification messages on whether the registration was approved or whether the registration failed to be approved. So this is how you use data context, a very powerful feature to assign data awareness to your interfaces and also target that particular record for update or delete. So with that, we are going to cover the last part of it, which is the delete registration feature. And what this demonstrates is how to delete a record using the same data context feature. But here's what I have done. I have put an interlock in this application that prevents me from deleting any registration that is not yet canceled, right? Uh, if it's not canceled, you cannot delete it, which makes sense. Now, let us say that this particular car registration has to be canceled for some reason. So using the same concept of approve registration, I now cancel the registration and I specify a rule. And probably what happened is this vehicle has now been made a permanent museum display because it's a classic car and therefore its registration is not valid anymore. So I cancel the registration. That's good. The registration has been canceled. Now you see the record has disappeared again, which is obvious because now the extension granted has gone to false, but this time you can see the cancel registration reason, right? Now I want to delete this record. So if I click on a record where the registration has not yet been canceled, if I click delete registration, you might want to look at the rules that govern this button. You can see that this button is disabled. And if I hover on it, it says registrations that are not canceled cannot be deleted, right? So please do take a look at the rules on how this has been done and how easily it has been done, right? But now I am going to try this record here, and I'm going to say delete registration. Now, sure enough, the delete registration button is enabled because there's a cancel reason. So the vehicle has been moved to a museum. There is no reason for it to exist in the delete in the registry database. So now I hit delete. And please do watch what happens here. The vehicle record has been expunged, right? So you don't see it in either of the filtered views. You don't see it in true. You don't see it in false. It has been permanently removed, and that effect is instant. So how did we do that? If I go to delete registration, again, please note the data context has been provided to this form via the data context feature. And if I hit delete registration, go into the events, edit rule, all you need to do is simply give it the ID of that record that you want to delete. Now, how do you do that? If I hit delete, you don't need any filters to do this because your record has already been identified to the data context. So if I go to equal to and go into the data context feature and take this entity and pull it in or double click on it, that specific entity is going to be targeted and deleted. It is that easy, right? So what you have seen here is an end-to-end demo of how to add data service entity to your app, how to view and filter your records, and how to target specific records using the filter or lookup functions, and how to impart data awareness to your application using the data context feature, which will then enable you to either update or delete those records in a targeted manner. Do we have time for
We
uh,
are actually close to our
yeah,
uh, time, a few minutes. But this is a, a very in-depth overview of an end-to-end life cycle of an application, right? With
right,
how do you
right,
build, but the basic CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete. So
right,
we have all gone through, and like there are some limitations when we are building it through queues, and that's where data services and data context, they come in and fill
right,
in that gap,
correct,
right? Because queues are not directly accessible in terms of data. So,
right,
and that's the purpose of data services to begin with. That's the reason why they are there, to provide that backend solution for any interactions. Now, this version with 22.10, there might have been some updates. We are still waiting to get our hands on access to that environment and see what new updates have come up. But we'll be watching it closely to find out those updates and bring that information back to the community here.
right.
Um, with that, I think, Andy, let's open it for our audience here. And if they have any questions, feedback, comments, because since this is the last session on our UiPath apps developer series, we would really like to learn their feedback, and so that we can improve upon and bring more interactive content in our next sessions.
Right.
So feel free to unmute yourself and share your comments. I don't see any questions right now in chat.
Any questions out there?
I'm sure our audience is stunned with observing the power of UiPath apps building such a complex application, right? But these are basic operations, right? Every OLTP application, online transaction processing application, goes through these stages. Um, in general, if you are building this in a real-time environment with Microsoft technology or Java platform, you would have a front-end application, a middle tier, and a database, right? But here, I won't compare them that the data services are as powerful as a relational database, but at least it shows the art of the possible.
Right.
Um, so while we are waiting for any further comments, I have a question for you, Andy. So let's say if this application, if I have to connect to SQL database, so how would you go about it, just briefly, in case some of our audiences have this question?
I am really not very sure if there is a direct integration with the SQL database, but maybe with integration service being made part of apps, it will allow us to do that,
Yeah,
right?
that is what I have also looked at, that integration services is the way to go when we are
Yeah,
building with full-fledged database programs.
right,
I believe the way they have, I have seen some other low-code platforms. That's how they provide access
right.
to other data, to external databases,
Yeah,
so that you can connect, and then essentially they become just a replica of data services,
yeah.
right? And then you can access them directly through apps and perform
I
further
mean, even
actions.
without integration service, if you want, there's another way to do it. You probably have an automation that will extract records out of the data service entities and then pump it into a SQL database. That itself will function like an integration service, right? The
Yeah.
app itself can do it. There are multiple ways to do it, right? I mean, there's no one fixed solution. Um, but one of the other things that I would like to do is, there are many ways you can improve this app, and if this interests you, I will also share the I think I can do that right now, if there is. I'm going to post that in the chat for if you're interested, because the basic app was built, um, and that has been discussed in this video, and you can take it from there, and you can see that what you saw here is a considerable enhancement to what's in that video. That app had maybe one or two functionalities, but we considerably enhanced it so that we can demonstrate everything that we could get under the umbrella of this app developer series. And I may post this later. I have a few ideas on how to enhance this and make it more interesting, which will also take you back to all your learnings about how to work with apps, queues, storage buckets, and also data service entity. And I might post that on LinkedIn. Of course, I'll be sharing this code with you. So please do download and give it a shot, because it pretty much covers almost every aspect of working with data service, right? And you can use this as a starter to your learning journey and then extend it to your own areas of expertise.
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. This provides a very strong foundation for apps building an end-to-end solution.
Right.
I hope this whole series helped everyone get excited about UiPath apps. And if you have not tried it before, you have seen us going through these step by step in a live session. So you see that it's very easy to spin up a screen, connect it with data services, data table, queues, and create events, right? And most of these things are readily available with minimal code. So as the name suggests, low code, definitely UiPath app stands true to it. Um, and going forward, we are also excited to look forward to what next release would come up with. So I would encourage everyone to try it out and let us know. Okay, so what challenges you face, not just the success part, that if you are able to successfully build it. Uh, and sure, if you have really built some awesome application, we would love to hear. But at the same time, if you have any challenges, reach out to Andy, myself, Diana. Our YouTube channels have been shared before, so reach out to either of those through those channels, or look up us on LinkedIn. You can directly feel free to connect with us and stay connected. That way we can see what we presented here was helpful, and update as we bring some more episodes in future.
Right. And to echo Pradeep's words, it's been a long series of 4 weeks to bringing the series to you, and
Yeah.
we are really, really thankful to all who have attended and or watched these recordings. And if there is sufficient interest in this topic of data service, please do let us know, and we would be happy to host another session on focusing on apps and data service. If you want a dedicated series to go deeper into this subject.
So thank you, everybody, for attending tonight. I'm not seeing any other questions. And Andy and Pradeep, thank you so much for spending your time with us to provide the community these sessions. We really appreciate it.
Yep. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good
Bye.
evening.